You're listening to Sex and Politics at Savage.Love. Sex and Politics.
We've taken a lot of calls here over the years from friends who are thinking about having a baby together, a gay man and his lesbian best friend, as well as calls from people who are worried about being outed as poly or kinky, or who have just been outed as poly or kinky and have lost custody of their kids or might lose custody of their kids or have already lost their jobs. And also calls from people who are wondering how they can protect their secondary or even tertiary partners in their wills. And my go-to guest expert in all of these cases, Diana Adams. They're an attorney in New York who specializes in protecting LGBTQ people and polyamorous people and their partners. In some cases, like the friends who want to co-parent, Diana helps people create and protect their families, but also protect themselves. They're the founder of Diana Adams Law and Mediation, a boutique law firm in New York City specializing in same-sex couples, platonic co-parents, polyamorous families, and also the executive director of Chosen Family Law Center. This is Sex and Politics, a special bonus podcast we do at Savage Lovecast for our Magnum subscribers. You, if you can hear the sound of my voice right now, are not yet a Magnum subscriber, but we wanted to share some of my conversation with Diana Adams with you to give you a little taste of what Sex and Politics is all about and to tempt you to become a Magnum sub. Like I said, Diana's been on the Lovecast a lot because they're the perfect person to turn to with questions about forming families that fall outside the heteronormative mold and the homonormative mold too. But I wanted to invite them on, Sex and Politics, because after so many years of talking with Diana about other people's problems, I was really curious about their journey, what attracted them as a working class kid to studying the law, how they began to specialize in the particular kind of legal work that they do, and how they formed their own family. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Diana Adams. Diana, thank you for coming back on the show.
I love being on the show, Dan. It's always an honor.
You've been on the Lovecast a few times, but I wanted to have you on Sex and Politics so we could have a more relaxed conversation, because I'm really interested in your history, your journey to polyamory and the kind of advocacy and the work that you do. And to do that, to really get into it. You know, the Lovecast, it's a little tighter, the show's a little shorter, and we've never really been able to have that kind of conversation on the Lovecast. And I wanted to have you on Sex and Politics to have that conversation. But first, congrats are in order. A big win today. Can you tell us about it?
Thank you. Yes, we just passed the first West Coast relationship structure and family status non-discrimination law in Oakland, California. So we've already passed that in Somerville and Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was drafted by an organization I co-founded, Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition, through my work at Chosen Family Law Center, my nonprofit. And we worked together with a bunch of legal academics and psychologists to draft this law so that it would allow for non-discrimination based on whatever your family status is, whatever your relationship status is, because that way that would include people who are polyamorous, but also people who are in platonic partnerships, people who are ace, people who do collective living, single parents. The majority of kids in this country don't live with a married mom and dad and are in some other kind of family configuration. The majority of American adults are in different kinds of family configurations. And this would allow for non-discrimination in Oakland for housing, for other kinds of government services. But moreover, every time we pass one of these laws, it raises awareness. It raises awareness about just how many of us are in other kinds of family structures, and that our whole system is set up revolving around this idea of a different sex married nuclear family instead of having a social welfare state. But only 18% of American adults are married. And then how many of the rest of us are polyamorous, like me, or in some other kind of family configuration that you can't see on paper? And so I think it's really valuable to be valuing the families that are out there, helping us all work on our shame about it. And also, this is part of not just doing this work in Oakland, but raising awareness for all of us of the fact that we all deserve to be valued in whatever kinds of caretaking relationships we're in, because in these times, we really need that caretaking.
Okay, so this new law that your organization helped pass in Oakland is going to protect people in polyamorous relationships, other relationship structures from discrimination. How often are people discriminated against because of their, they're in a polyamorous triad, or they have a platonic triad or quad partnership where they're home sharing? The problem being addressed by this legislation, how big a problem is it?
It's a really good question because it's difficult for us to see. this kind of discrimination often happens in covert ways. When I tried to rent an apartment most recently a few years ago in New York City, I applied to 100 apartments and was only invited to view 20, even though I have perfect credit and was amply financially able to afford the apartment. Is that because I'm a non-binary, transgender, and polyamorous activist? Potentially. That could have been part of it, but of course, they don't say that when they reject you, right? But every time we make discrimination less socially acceptable, less normalized, that helps all of us. And we do see in situations like child custody cases that being polyamorous or another kind of family configuration is used against people. I see this as supportive and helpful, using lessons from the same-sex domestic partnership movement, that once the state has stamped something, once a male same-sex couple could, go and have a cute picture in front of City Hall and have a piece of paper, suddenly their churches and their parents and their employers were willing to say, yes, it's acceptable for your husband to come to the company function. Yes, it's acceptable to have a picture of the two of you. And perhaps it's my problem and it's uncouth for me now, even if it's just about what's socially acceptable, to be openly discriminating against people.
I wanted to jump in and say this, anybody out there thinking, okay, there's no poly triad in Oakland whose
Right.
landlord is attempting to discriminate against them. But this is how it's done. I'm old enough and gay enough to remember a time when there weren't even domestic partnership registries anywhere in the entire country. And we won marriage equality first by, in a city like Madison, Wisconsin, or some other college town, or Seattle, getting domestic partnership registries that then became civil unions, that then became state-level marriage equality laws that passed at the ballot box, that then became the victory at the Supreme Court. And this is how you build protections for people in different kinds of relationship structures. It is the model, it is the roadmap of marriage equality. You start with a city like Oakland, where this isn't controversial, in the same way that, being gay in Madison, Wisconsin, there were still bigots, there were still homophobes, but it wasn't controversial, and it made sense to people to pass a domestic partnership registry that allowed a same-sex couple to have a piece of paper that they could show to a landlord that gave this stamp of, state approval shouldn't really matter, but sometimes you need that piece of paper, and it matters. And there is discrimination against individuals and couples and triads and quads based on their relationship structures or how they love. And your organization, Chosen Family Law Center, takes those cases. And often it's child custody, where, a vindictive ex finds out that their former partner with whom they share kids has two partners now, and they sue for child custody or to bar visitation based on the prejudices that attach to people who have more than one partner, and to protect that person who may live in some shitty part of downstate Illinois where there isn't the kind of law that just passed in Oakland. You need to build piece by piece protections that cover everybody, in the same way that piece by piece we built protections for all same-sex couples by moving marriage equality from city domestic partner registries to state protections for same-sex couples, to state same-sex marriage laws, to federal rights for same-sex couples.
Exactly. That's the strategy. So it's not necessarily about a massive concern of discrimination against poly people in Oakland or in Cambridge or Somerville, but instead about building this momentum. And it's also a way for progressive cities to take a stand that's in opposition to the way that many red states, many places in this country, we hear these horrible city council and school board meetings, talking about trans people as less than human, talking about massive potential infringements on women's rights. And this is a way to go in the other direction and say, we are going to be a queer utopia. We want the Boston area, we want the Bay Area to be the kind of place that is the opposite of that, where this is a place that you can come to. And frankly, in some of the trans sanctuary bills that I've been involved in New York State, and in Chicago, in the state of Illinois, there's an intentional awareness of, we want to make it easier for your queer people and your feminists to get out of that state and come here. A lot of these bills are making it easier to streamline the professional licensing so that maybe a lawyer or a physical therapist or a doctor or a teacher could get their state license transferred. And frankly, in part, it's not just benevolent, it's also strategic. I'll happily take your brain drain to Chicago or the Bay Area or to the Boston area, Florida. Go ahead. Have people like me and Dan and, lots of feminists want to leave and want to come and do interesting things where we are instead.
All my life, I always said for decades, queer peoples are refugees. If you grew up in a place with 500, I've heard someone describe this as a kind of metropolitanism, which is this idea that to be queer, you have to go to the big city. Well, if you grow up in a place with 500 people, there's not going to be much of a dating scene there, even if it was a wonderfully accepting place. And we are, queer people move to the cities. I remember meeting queer people who were refugees in the city that they grew up in because they had to flee their homophobic families. And so they lived on the other side of Chicago and never saw their family of origin. And they kind of had a refugee vibe, even if they didn't have to go far, even if it was just an L ride away. And as red states become worse and worse about queer people, about women's rights, about trans people, you are seeing more refugees fleeing these places for blue states, for more welcoming, bigger cities. And the passage of a law like this in Oakland really does send up a flare. It also shows that we can still make progress, that we're not just fighting an endless rearguard action to protect the wins we've already had. We can have a win, and this is a win. And it's really inspiring to see this win. So congrats on it.
Thank you. And I agree that I think it's important that we take those wins. Sometimes it's controversial. I've been in the LGBTQIA legal movement for 20 years now. And sometimes there's been this discussion of like, we can only focus on same-sex marriage, just like we can only focus on Roe v. Wade in terms of feminism and just hang on to what we can get. We don't have time to talk about trans issues. We don't have time to talk about family structure or polyamory. And I see it differently. I think that we can do both at the same time, and also advocating for our own personal liberty and having these wins at a local level keeps up our own personal inspiration. It keeps up my own inspiration as I try to write trans sanctuary bills in New York State. It keeps up my inspiration to be able to get affirmed that there are places that are with us, that want us, where queer people, where trans people, where polyamorous people aren't just tolerated, but celebrated and welcomed.
I wanted to have you on sex and politics because we've had these conversations on the Lovecast where we briefly touched on our histories as both of us, poly people in polyamorous relationships. But I wanted to be able to have a more relaxed conversation. I want to know more about you. Where did you grow up? And when you were a young person, what did you want out of love? What kind of relationship did you think about having when you were an adult? I'm going to guess here that when you were 13, the kind of relationships that as an adult were the right relationships for you weren't the relationships you were even able to conceive of. The only people I've met who are poly from the beginning of their sexually active adult lives, poly from the jump, are people under 30 who benefited from those of us who were older in poly and came to polyamory being out and open about it and put it in their heads that this was an option for them. But where did you start?
Thank you for asking that, Dan. And I have been openly bi for 25 years, polyamorous for 20 years. And I grew up in a small town in upstate New York and did not have internet access, didn't have exposure to anything other than the options of, marry a man. And frankly, as a working class girl, I was socialized to want to marry a rich man. You want to get out of here. That's your ticket out. Meanwhile, I was very smart and found my own ticket out by getting some financial aid and going to Yale. But that wasn't one of the options that was presented to me. And I remember having a lot of fear and anxiety because I knew I wanted to have kids. I wanted to have connection. I wanted to fall in love. But I didn't even have the word for bisexual, or polyamory. But I knew in my heart that this was not going to be easy for me. And I imagined with fear that, sure, maybe I'm going to marry some nice doctor, but I'm probably also going to be sleeping with my nanny. And I might also be sleeping with the pool boy. And I just don't know that I could, choose to be with a man instead of a woman for the rest of my life. And also that monogamy was something that I actually wanted. And I think I came to a place of being interested in polyamory before I had those words because I saw so much oppression of working class women around me, domestic violence in my own family and in my own communities, the ways that women being financially entrapped and entangled by men kept women in abusive relationships or just unhappy relationships, just controlling relationships. And so the idea that I was going to try to find my freedom by finding the best one of those rich guys to own me was not appealing to me.
Wait, I'm a little confused. Like you looked around and you saw a lot of women in your community in shitty abusive relationships, and your thought as to how to solve for that was have multiple potentially shitty abusive relationships?
No.
Draw the line between those dots for me.
Yeah, good clarification. I think I wanted to not have anybody be able to be in control of my sexuality or my financial well-being. I didn't want to be financially dependent within a marriage. And I also really chafed at jealous boyfriends, being able to tell me, or my dad being able to tell me what I could wear, what I couldn't wear, because they didn't want men looking at me, when it felt like this is my body and my decision. And if you're uncomfortable with it, we can talk about it. But I wanted to be in control of my own body and my own sexuality and not have a man tell me what I could and couldn't do in terms of relating to other people, just as I didn't want to be in a situation of feeling financially controlled and coerced into being in a marriage and then feel stuck. So I didn't have the words for it at the time. And you were actually my first queer friend, Dad, because I grew up in a small town near Albany. And when there was a chance to drive into the big city of Albany, we would pick up the free artsy paper, and your column was in the paper. And I would secret it away into the backseat of the car and be so excited to read it because you were the first queer person I knew of, period. And then it was like Ellen on TV, but but hearing your voice was incredibly powerful for me. And you were actually a bit of hope, even if you were, writing about blowjobs and things like that at the time, which is great. But it just gave me some hope of both open sexuality and queerness. And it encouraged me to find other people. And now it's awesome that I get to be on the Lovecast and be your friend.
That was a little bit of my conversation here on Sex and Politics with Diana Adams, Executive Director of the Chosen Family Law Center. If you'd like to hear the entire conversation with Diana Adams, please consider becoming a Magnum subscriber today at Savage.Love.